Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is episode 59 of my secular Bible study series in which we're going to look at the book of James. Now, I'm a bit under the weather today, so bear with me, but I think we can get through this together, and it should be worth it because James is quite the little book. It is only 5 chapters long, and yet it is filled with teaching. It is more reminiscent of the Old Testament Jewish wisdom literature than it is of the New Testament by faith and theological heaviness. This is a practical book of how Christians should be living, and there are pros and cons that come along with that. So we're going to dive right into point 1, book overview, and break this down into 8 quick sections. Section 1 is about faith in action. First, we're going to be warned about the trials and the perseverance that are going to be required to build one's faith. Where James does fit in well with all of the others here is that he believes Christians will be especially persecuted and that they must continue to endure, and that in doing this, they will mature spiritually and set the foundation for living out the Christian faith as it is required. In this section, James differentiates between trials that test faith and actual temptations that lead to sin. He emphasizes that God is not the source of temptation and that he only gives good and perfect gifts. We will talk more about that in point 7. Also found in this section, and James is really setting up the rest of his teaching here, is the command to not just be hearers of the word, but doers of the word, something many of us are probably very familiar with. It comes from this early part of the book of James. So now that we know that we will be persecuted, that we will need to persevere, and that we know we will be tempted and tested, and that we can't just listen to these words, we have to actually do them. What are the instructions? And that's what's going to follow in the coming sections. So segment 2 gets into social justice. First, warning against favoritism. James is saying, hey, it's not just the rich or the wealthy that you need to be kind to or to take care of. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It is the poor, it is the needy that need your love and action the most. He is calling for true equality here. And again, nothing wrong with this at all. In fact, the next part of this segment is also fine, where he is reminding people of the royal law to love your neighbor as yourself. Of course, this can't be done without a carrot and stick, and so he warns them and reminds them that those who show mercy will have mercy bestowed on them, and those who judge will be judged themselves. Segment 3 is where we start running into trouble, as this is where it becomes about works. Most notably from this part is the faith without works is dead, which is in complete contradiction to what Paul talks about. And again, stay tuned for point 7. And also we get good examples of living faith. And of all the people he could have pulled from, he chooses Abraham, who was willing to kill his son, and Rahab, who again, I will never understand this point, was supposedly so faithful for helping the spies. Segment 4 is all about speech, or the power of the tongue. He has many analogies here, but my favorite is the small spark that can start a fire. And again, I think this teaching is actually really nice. I think it's really wise. Words matter. It's a shame that James didn't choose some of his a bit better, but that's another point. Here, James really highlights the inconsistency of the tongue, something that can both bless and curse, something that can offend and then be turned around to praise the creator of everything. So he is urging believers to make sure that their speech reflects their faith. Again, this whole thing is about faith in action. Segment 5 gets into wisdom in general, although you could classify all of this so far as wisdom teaching, but specifically here, he is talking about what it means to actually be wise, and he is contrasting it against the wise person that is boasting about their wisdom and their knowledge, who is arrogant and filled with selfish ambition and says, if you are truly wise, you will demonstrate that wisdom through good acts. And later in this segment, he goes on to describe what heavenly wisdom looks like. It is pure, it is peace-loving, it is considerate, submissive, and full of mercy, as well as impartial and sincere. Segment 6 talks a lot about community. Again, regardless of who we believe wrote this or when, which we'll get to in just a minute in point 2, the early Christian church was really trying to figure out, how do Christians live, how should they act, and how do they interact with each other? What kind of community do they have, and how should it look? So first, James tries to identify the root cause of the conflict among amongst believers, and he narrows down on a couple things: selfish desires and a lack of prayer. Now, there's a lot of things you might have thought of when I first said that sentence, and I think that what James arrived at is really interesting. But of course, he calls for repentance and returning to God. He then goes on to warn about friendship with the world. The old Christian claim that the world is evil, that everything is separate, that to be a believer, to be Christian, to do good in the world, etc., one needs to distance themselves from everyone else. It is the in-group versus the out-group. And we wonder why we have so many issues with this yet today. Funny enough, immediately following that is James talking about how we shouldn't judge others. He believes there is only one judge and a lawgiver. And again, when you consider, and this is something that people I think don't think about enough, most of these audiences that Jesus was speaking to, which was mainly Jewish, or that Paul was speaking to, which was mainly Christian Gentile converts, or that James is speaking to, again, Jewish Christians, they are speaking about what to do within your own community. So, something I think is important to note. Let's move on to segment 7, only 2 left here, and this one is going to be on humility. Here, he warns against boasting for tomorrow. It's a reminder that God is sovereign. He's going to do whatever he wants, so your plans are essentially meaningless. And of course, we have to make sure we condemn the rich, which is the next part in this segment. To be fair, this is more for the really wealthy landowners that aren't helping the poor, as opposed to other verses where we have just an idea that to be wealthy is bad. So that's better, I guess, but it comes with heavy warnings where he prophesizes about their eventual destruction. And then to wrap up the final segment, it's kind of hard, there's a lot going on here, but we'll just say perseverance, prayer, and patience. He starts off by saying we need, as believers, to be patient in suffering. Patiently waiting for what? The Lord's return. And he compares this to farmers and prophets and even Job. So for over 2,000 years, we've had this suffer like Job, which is terrible advice and only shows how awful this God would be if he were real. He then gets into the power of prayer and the necessity for it, and then kind of a final call of perseverance, especially for those that have strayed, to return, emphasizing again the power of the Christian community. So that is segment 1, and I wanted to take some time because, again, for a book that is so heavy on the wisdom and how to act out the Christian faith, I wanted to get into some of those details. Hopefully we can kind of breeze through these next few sections. So section 2 is authorship and date. This is generally and traditionally attributed to James, the half-brother of Jesus, who James is the English name that we get from Jacob, which is still kind of an English translation from what it really was. So there's some confusion there. And there's a lot of James in the New Testament. This is not one of the 12. You had James the son of Zebedee and James the son of Alphaeus that were both followers of Christ. But Jesus' half-brother James here is someone we hear about in some of the Gospels and specifically in the book of Acts, which doesn't help out a lot as Acts is just pretty much complete fiction. But even Paul references James the Just, which is another name that he goes by, as the Lord's brother, who was a prominent leader in the early Christian church in Jerusalem. We hear about that leadership on the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. The really funny thing is, if you read that, one of the things that was so important that he was deciding over or ruling over was circumcision. And I just think, like, this is where things start to go off the rail for me a little bit. You have Jesus, and really think about Jesus's message. And by the way, James echoes a lot of Jesus's message. I didn't really mention this, but he covers so much from the Sermon on the Mount, as well as from some of the wisdom books and some of the Old Testament examples. But you have this Jesus who could not have cared less about these typical Jewish traditions and customs and the law in many aspects of his preaching. And then his half-brother, who is in this prominent role in a still very Jewish but Christian community in the heart of it, in Jerusalem, making big decisions about circumcision. And it kind of brings you back to what everyone was actually dealing with after Jesus is gone. What are the rules? What should we do? What's right? What do we still hold on to? What do we let go? How are we saved? And it's interesting to think that, yeah, this James wasn't part of the 12, but he was still incredibly and obviously close with Jesus and grew up with him. So you have him, and then you have Peter, who is such a close disciple of Jesus, who is the rock that the church will be built off. And then you have Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, and all three of them seem to have different ideas about Jesus and his teaching and what's right and what faith is and what salvation is. And I just think that's so interesting. So there is some modern pushback that this wasn't written by James the Just. And the reasons for that are the rhetorical style, the Greek writing, saying that James obviously wouldn't have been trained well in Greek or these Hellenistic methods. And then the rebuttal to that is he probably had a scribe who helped turn these words into this fashion, and that's definitely possible. So it's not a hill I'm willing to die on to say that this is a book that is not authentically from the author. It's very possible it was written later and attached to James, this very prominent figure, to get that extra boost of influence. It doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, it's all considered canon. This is what Christians believe. And so my focus is more about critiquing it and helping you understand it than it is who wrote it. That is important to some degree, especially when you're talking about anonymous authors in the Gospels versus firsthand eyewitness testimony. But that's my diatribe on this. Let's move on. For the dating part, it's between 44 and 62. 44 would be the early part of his ministry and leadership, 62 close to his martyrdom. We do believe that James was martyred. Note that no matter when it is before the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. And so that is another big flag for dating this because it doesn't cover that. So earlier seems to fit, although again, some of these scholars that think it was written later and not by James place it between 80 and 100. So that's kind of the wide range of who could have written this book and when, but I think we can move straight into point 3, which is a little bit of historical context. So unlike many of the Pauline epistles, this was not written to one specific church or one specific person. Kind of like Hebrews, this was written to the Christian Jews living outside of Palestine, often referred to as the 12 tribes in the dispersion or the diaspora. This started way back when we had the exile from Babylon, and some of the Jews did not go back and they scattered. And this has continued on. And so you have Jews in places like Syria and Asia Minor, which is now Turkey, Egypt, and even Rome. And so this is for them in all of their different communities that they are probably facing persecution, James believes, and this is essentially trying to unite them. So this audience would have been very familiar with both Jewish law and custom and tradition, as well as the teachings of Jesus. The biggest thing to understand, and we've talked about it a lot, so I just say go watch some of the other videos, is that this is a time that is rooted in the socioeconomic realities of the Roman Empire, particularly in the eastern provinces where the earlier Jewish Christian communities had started to form. At this time in the Roman Empire, you had this social stratification where you had really small groups, this elite class that was controlling the vast amount of wealth and land, while the majority of the population lived in poverty. And so you kind of see this reflected in James' writing, specifically there in chapter 2, where he's talking about how we should be thinking about the wealthy, etc. So there's a lot of social tension going on. Of course, we had debt slavery, economic exploitation in general. There's just a lot that we have covered. So I found myself getting right back into it, but always with the backdrop of the Roman Empire and the newly Christianized Jews is what's important to remember here. So let's move straight on to point 4, which is literary analysis. So kind of a unique genre, we would consider this New Testament wisdom literature. It is a collection of ethical exhortations. It also has elements of homilies and sermons, and it is written with a large sense of urgency, this pastoral care. Here's the instruction. Here's what you need to know. Here's why. Here's when. Do this now or else. The writing style itself is extremely direct. In fact, there are over 50 imperative verbs used in just 108 verses. That really shows you how much he is just preaching. Do this, do this. It's really interesting to kind of look at the numbers behind this. In addition to all those commands, we have a great use of rhetorical questions. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? These kinds of questions are all over this book. There's a lot of vivid imagery. I talked about one of my favorites, comparing the tongue to the flame in James 3:6. We have a lot of contrast, like faith without works is dead. We have some interesting motifs, like the double-minded man and the perfect law of liberty. It's rich with metaphors and similes and analogies, and of course the imagery that we talked about. A great use of parallelism. There's proverbs and aphorisms. I mean, what doesn't James employ here? And so again, a very unique and crammed little book of 5 chapters. So that is the literary analysis. Moving straight on to point 5, main themes. I think I explained most of these in segment 1 pretty well, so I'll just list them off for us so we have them in one place. Faith and works, controlled speech, wealth and poverty, patience in suffering, and last would be wisdom from above. Those 5 things, I think, generally summarize the book of James pretty well. So moving on to point 6, reception and influence. The first one to note is just the funniest thing to me. You have Martin Luther during the Reformation, where he calls this book an epistle of straw. He absolutely hates the contradiction that is glaringly obvious here, where James says that it is not faith alone, it is also by works, where obviously for Luther, justification by faith alone was a big point. So not just with Luther, but this book, James, was seen as something at the very least tension, if not outright fear, from other prominent early Christian figures like Origen and Eusebius. So Origen is 3rd century, and he recognizes the value of the epistle, but he was hesitant to place it on the same level as other Christian literature in terms of its authority. And then Eusebius, which is 4th century, listed James among the disputed books, simply acknowledging that while some questioned it, others accepted it. And so this book has always had a lot of contention around it, and yet it is 100% part of the Christian canon. By the time of some significant councils, like the Council of Carthage in 397 or the Council of Hippo in 393, it was kind of finally accepted in the canon along other New Testament scripture that we're familiar with. And I kind of started with Luther, and then we jump back to some of the early church fathers, but even John Calvin kind of didn't go as far as Luther in this kind of total rejection, but found a balance with it himself and still struggled. And Calvin is where we get kind of the popular Christian apologetic for today, this balance of, well, you know, James and Paul were talking about the same thing, but from different angles. He says Paul focused on justification before God, where James is focusing on justification before man, where works are the outward evidence of faith. And this is the big thing, and I'm probably jumping into contradictions, but I'll just cover quickly. The main apologetic that you'll hear is, belief alone saves you. You know, this is straight from the book of John. Believe and be saved. Now, there's some other verses that still contradict even within the Gospels, but if you're kind of going off John, which is our main theological doctrine gospel, then you get this free gift salvation. All we have to do is believe. Confess your belief before the Lord and receive eternal life. And then someone brings up James and they say, well, yes, okay, because if you really believe, you can't help but be changed by Christ. And so your actions will show that. And so it's this little song and dance of, okay, it's just believe, but if you actually believe, and now we get into all the judgment, and it just opens the door for all this abuse and shaming of other Christians, which is hilarious because they're utilizing this book of James, which talks about not judging your fellow Christian. But they'll say, hey, you're doing this. You're giving into this same sin over and over. You're living this lifestyle. You're doing this. You're doing that. Therefore, you must not really believe. If you really believed, it would look like this. And the fact that these verses exist in the way that they do is something you'll never get away from. And it will always cause this amount of controversy and contradiction and judgment and fear and all of the other things that come because of this confusion. And for every Christian that tells you they have it understood, they know the answer. It is this and it means this, and you just have to apply it this way. There's another Christian that thinks the exact opposite. I'll leave that alone. Of course, there's other trickle-down effects and influences from the book of James that have made their way into modern leadership in the church and the responsibility of Christian community. We could talk about all of that, but it's pretty similar to what we've covered in previous books. With that said, let's move on to point 7, which we cover contradictions and problematic passages. So I think we can skip the faith versus works contradictions, but if you want the specific verses, it's James 2:24. You see that a person is justified by works, not by faith alone. That's what's so funny about this particular contradiction is there's no room for guessing. This isn't like, oh, you're reading it wrong. This could not be more clear. And to show you the stark contrast, we could use so many verses, but I think Romans 3 does it best. For we maintain that a person is justified by faith, apart from the works of the law. It really doesn't get any more clear. Every single time someone says there's no contradictions in the Bible, it's like, look just at this one. But again, you have all these amazing 2,000 years of Christian tradition and apologetics that, by the way, doesn't agree with itself, giving shelter, giving comfort, saying, no, you don't understand. It does work together like this, like that. But let's move on to some other ones. This one's pretty funny to me because going back to these two men, James and Paul, who are both trying to make a different case for how one receives justification, they both use Abraham as an example. Let me read to you. James 2:21, was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? Paul says, backing his point up, if in fact Abraham was justified by works, he had something to boast about, but not before God. What does Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Paul's is doubly interesting because he's doubling down on Scripture, saying we have this example from Abraham, and if it had been by his work, that would have meant he was doing it. But if we read further, we see that it was credited to him as righteousness, his belief. Abraham believed God, thus righteousness. And James is trying to make the exact opposite point. James obeyed God, thus righteousness. It's just so funny to see how it continues down the line. One I told you that we would get back to is James 1:13. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. Ooh, I'm not even sure which verse to pick out to make as the contradiction here, but I think what will be funny is sticking with Abraham. In Genesis 22:1, sometime later, God tested Abraham. Now, if you want to say, well, a test is different than being tempted, what was the test for? For killing his son. You don't think that Abraham felt tempted to disobey this order? I see it as a completely unnecessary distinction. And if you need more verses about God tempting people, let's give you some. In Deuteronomy 8:2, remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. That's like the definition of temptation. What are we being tempted to do? To sin. What is sin? Not keeping the Lord's commands. How anyone could argue that God does not tempt his people is so silly to me. In Judges 2:21-22, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it like their ancestors did. Keep the way of the Lord. Temptation to sin. It's the same thing. Now, many people who defend the James verse that God does not tempt people say, well, it's not God tempting, it's the devil, it's Satan. Well, then we'll just use Job as the example. What does the Satan have to do before he goes and tempts Job to sin? To curse God. He gets permission from God. And does God grant it? Yes, he does. If you're going to take that responsibility away from God in that scenario, you're being completely dishonest. It's just unbelievably clear. Again, another completely solid contradiction from the book of James. I don't know if this next one is best used as a problematic passage or a contradiction, but James 5:14-15. Is anyone among you sick? Let them call the elders of the church to pray over them and anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise them up. Well, we can just look to 2 Corinthians 12:7-9, where Paul, someone of great faith, by the way, says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Now, this is one small example. I wanted to give you a biblical example of this not working, where a prayer offered in faith does not equal sickness being alleviated. There are many churches today where if you are sick or ill, you can still go before them. The elders will anoint you in oil. Sorry, I'm having a coughing fit. My face probably just turned red. The irony, maybe I should try this. Go down to my local church. That's what I was saying. They still have these places you can go, and the elders will literally anoint you with oil and pray with you that you will be better. And according to James, it should happen. And what's funny is every single time that this is put into practice and doesn't work, it is the person who is blamed, their lack of faith. See my conversation with Holy Kool-Aid on faith healing. So not only is this verse problematic because it sets people up for failure, oftentimes they are not seeking medical attention, and when it doesn't work, they are blamed and shamed, but it is also contradictory to even how we see God operate in the Bible, where he doesn't care to heal everybody. And even for his foremost apostle with great faith, it was not enough to heal him. So if God's sovereignty is really what's important here, then let's stop giving these false hopes of how to be healed, how to have prayers answered. Now, it's never fun for me to use Old Testament versus New Testament when I talk about contradictions, because so many people want to point to the new covenant and Jesus's resurrection changing everything. But I'm going to call this one out specifically because James uses Proverbs so much in his preaching and teaching. So James 4:13 through 15. Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this city or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why? You do not even know that will happen tomorrow. Instead, you ought to say, it is the Lord's will. We will live and do this or that. But the wisdom literature that James is quoting so often and alluding to is not agreeing. Proverbs 21:5 says, the plans of the diligent lead to profit as surely as haste leads to poverty. Much of the Old Testament wisdom literature is about planning and being wise and being a good steward. And then we get this New Testament idea of depend on God completely, which, by the way, is horrible advice. We've seen it acted out and failed, and yet that is what James is preaching. Contradictory ideas, especially for someone that is utilizing Proverbs for other parts of his teaching. Going back to this issue with faith being a variable for failure or success in God's eyes, James 1:6 through 8. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Well, I already gave the verse about Jesus talking about faith the size of a mustard seed, which to me would leave a little room for doubt. But we have a very specific example in Mark 9:24. Jesus responds very compassionately to a man who admits to struggling. He says, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. It suggests there that God can work with imperfect faith, and yet James says he cannot. And not only is this biblically contradictory, but how many times do we see Christian testimony of someone that was like, I didn't even believe in God, but I was just at my, I was at my wit's end. I was at my last resort, and I said, God, if you're real, that's doubt. That's not pure faith. And yet, how many times do we hear that God met them in that moment? So don't celebrate that person. Don't believe their testimony if James is in your canon. And again, just ripe for abuse. I just need to combine these and consider them all problematic passages because we pretty much talk about that as we go. That being said, let's just move straight into problematic passages. Just to get it on the screen, we already covered James 2:24, which is about faith alone not being enough for justification. Let's go to James 5:1 through 6. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming to you. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. Now, I mentioned earlier that in terms of condemnation for the rich, this is a little better than some of what Paul does sometimes because it is about not taking care of the poor as opposed to just being wealthy for the sake of being wealthy. But the verbiage here is so harsh. There's so much contempt. There's no gentleness. There's no calling and love. This is just anger and bitterness. I mean, it's just oozing out. And furthermore, I wanted to call out this verse because it also suggests, as does like 3 or 4 other places in James, that even James thought the end was near. These last days, 80 generations later, 2,000 years later, here we still are in the last days. These are sure lasting a long time. And I know all the excuses, but if you look at this clearly, now we have Jesus, Paul, and James so far in our New Testament canon that have all said and thought that the end was near, and near in the way that we mean it. Not the, well, to God, a day is 1,000 years. Not any of that apologetic nonsense. Let's add James 1:6 through 8 up there. That is the one about doubt. And let's get into James 3:1. Not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. Now, I'm all for caution of any promotion of leadership or authority, especially religious authority, because it does offer such a chance for this thing to be abused. But being the prominent leader yourself who is contradicting the ideas of Jesus at some points and contradicting Paul at others and being wrong in general, as you judge others, including this group you're speaking to, you've obviously judged some of them hey, you don't want to be leaders because I know you, and leaders get judged more harshly. Like, this is a failure of James all around. James the judgmental. I honestly really struggle with James's tone and word choice and harshness. And again, I'm totally fine with tough love, but this is very different. This continues to come off as this, it seems like the very thing Jesus would rebuke. It seems like James is still really holding on to the position and prominence and power of being a leader, a lot of kind of self-indulgence with his own works and keeping the law and preventing others from getting involved deeper in the ministry. That seems like the very kind of thing Jesus would have been wagging his finger at. Going back and forth, but let's get James 5:14 through 15 up there. Again, the verse that talks about how to be healed and all of the abuse and horror that leads to. And I did mention a little bit, but let's go deeper on James 4:4, which says, "You adulterous people, don't you know that friendship with the world means enmity against God? Therefore, anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God." I hate this distinction. Did God not make the world? Did God not make everyone? I understand how James is using this separation, creating this in-group, out-group that I find so disgusting, but just come on. How is this going to help anyone? All this is really saying is Christians are better. Don't be a non-Christian. You're called to a higher purpose. Only you can follow God. Only you can be saved by God. Only through your work can you be justified. And all those people that are not like us are bad, are evil, are literally the enemies of God. And you wonder why Christians can often be self-righteous and look down on the non-believers. It's really horrendous. This is not love. This is not inclusion, all of the things that supposedly Christ stands for. This is division and separation and judgment and hate. Again, just putting it up there, James 4:13 through 15. "Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to this city or that city. Why? You do not even know that will happen tomorrow." Now, on one hand, yes, good practical advice of how quickly things can change in this world. And we need to be able to adapt, sure. But that's not what he's saying. He's saying the end is about to come. You're wasting your time. Let God lead your every step, even if it means death. It is the kind of verse that has led many people, especially young people, to be reckless in their 20s or 30s, to not plan. And you know what? Those people, the end doesn't come. They live to 60, 70, 80, 90. They haven't worked. They've been relying on God, or more specifically from generous Christians, so far in their life. They haven't developed the personal responsibility or foresight needed to secure something for themselves or their family. It's bad advice. And again, it's contradictory of the wisdom literature, specifically what I read in Proverbs, that is actually good advice. Yeah, you don't know what tomorrow holds. That's why you should be wise with what you have. That's why you should plan and be a good steward, so that if it comes, you're not left being needy and stranded. I think I'm going to end it there, mainly because I'm just not feeling well. There's a ton more problematic passages here, because this book, these 5 chapters, are filled, again, with commands and analogies and warnings that I think typically do more harm than good. Let me know your thoughts on this one. Thank you so much. Stay tuned. On Sunday, I plan to have the podcast episode out with Kristi Burke. We had an awesome conversation, and I cannot wait for you guys to hear it. Until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Ann, Boris, GVI, Jacob, Jason, Joe, Kitboga, Perry, Rokkit, Shawn, and StrongRex, my Humanist heroes Imposter, James, Jarrod, and Kristi, my Atheist advocates Caleb, Jeff, Jeffrey, JimothyJones, Mrs. Webb, Paul, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my Secular Scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people.